Hello everyone, I am Siddharthan. A few months ago, I was working on a generative AI project in Python and there was a tight deadline. So everything was going fine until I had to set it up on another machine for deployment. So suddenly packages were breaking, versions were mismatched in the libraries, and my virtual environment basically refused to cooperate. So I spent more time trying to fix my environment than writing the actual code. And I'm sure that you probably would have been in the same situation where you are facing like issues with the conflicts that arises from the different Python libraries and so on. So then I discovered poetry. Within minutes, I had a clean project setup, reproducible environments, and a single command to install everything, even on a fresh system. And that basically changed everything. So today, I thought I can make this video where we can go through the exact steps I wish I knew earlier. How to use poetry to make your Python development cleaner, faster, and way more professional. So this will be the agenda for today's video where we will learn how to get started with poetry, which is a more standard and production based approach of how you can manage your dependencies, how you can manage your projects and environments rather than just like using a requirements.txt. So let's get started. So before getting into the actual hands-on part of setting this up in your system, right? So first let's try to understand what are all the advantages that poetry gives over the usual pip install that we do on a requirements.txt file. So let's first try to understand that. So I've built this comparative table which gives us more clarity on this. So you probably would have already known requirements.txt if you have worked on some AI, ML stuff or any Python projects, right? Where let's say if you're working with pandas library or numpy libraries, so you would put that in a requirements.txt file with the exact version and then do pip install -r requirements.txt. That's going to install all the libraries, right? uh, but let's see how poetry is different and what are all the advantages it has over the usual pip install requirements that we do. So poetry manages dependencies and virtual environments automatically. Dependencies are nothing but the libraries that we need. So it can be your pandas, it can be your numpy, langchain, or the libraries that we use. So poetry manages those dependencies automatically, and also it automatically manages the virtual environments and everything related to it. Whereas in the case of actually, using this requirements or txt and so on, you have to manually create your VNV. So you have to manually create your virtual environments and so on, and you have to like install all these libraries, right? So we would say that pip install requirements or txt, and if you install something else from your terminal, you have to make sure that you mention those libraries in your requirements or txt as well later. Let's say I'm installed langchain from my terminal. I shouldn't forget to put it back on the requirements.txt. So that a lot of manual stuffs are involved when we are working with pip and requirements.txt. Whereas in the case of poetry, most of these things are like managed automatically, including the dependencies and the virtual environments. So in the case of poetry, there are like two key files. One is our pyproject.2yaml file and a poetry.log files. So these two files are going to contain informations on the projects. It's going to contain the information about the library versions that you're going to need, and in poetry log it's going to log all the dependencies that you need. So if you're using pandas, what's the exact library version it has to use and so on. Whereas in the case of requirements.txt, we only just like mention whatever the libraries that we need. If it's 10 libraries, we would just mention that with the exact library version numbers. But in poetry we manage that in pyproject.2yaml and poetry.log, which also gives us more flexibility and features that we can have in order to manage our different environments. So we will get to know that more when we do the actual hands-on part. But remember that these are the two main files that we have: pyproject.2yaml and poetry.log. So these are the main aspects. And it auto resolves and logs exact versions. Let's try to understand this. What's meant by this auto resolve? So let's say that you are installing langchain. You have mentioned some exact version and you are installing pandas, and then you are installing, let's say, numpy. So you are installing three versions. Now langchain requires one particular pandas version, and let's say numpy doesn't work with that pandas requirement, like that pandas version, right? So now numpy requires a different version of pandas, but langchain requires a different version of pandas. So there would rise a conflict that you have to solve manually if you're using a pip install requirement. So the manual version pending needed and so on. So it's like there's going to be some conflicts that's going to arise, and you have to manually either downgrade one of the libraries and try to find like which is the most optimum combinations of versions, and try to make sure that you are working with the latest versions as much as possible. Whereas in the case of poetry, you can just like simply run the poetry install command. It's automatically going to resolve all those conflicts and give you the best possible combinations possible if there are any conflicts. And it logs exact versions including internal libraries. This is a very key aspect that we have in poetry, and this is one of the exact problem that I face. So let's say that I'm working on langchain and a bunch of 10 other libraries. So what we would do if we are working with pip requirements, so we would mention all those 10 library versions, right? And then we would just install it, and then we would just like go about our project work. So what happened is like I worked on this, and later in one of the cases I had to restart this application like after a month. And when I tried to install this, even this was in Docker. That's like the more challenging part. So Docker should handle all these things because it's making a containerized thing, right? Suddenly I'm getting some issues on the versions of the libraries and so on. So what happened is, think about this. Let's say there is a library, again, something like NumPy library is there. I didn't, mention NumPy libraries in the requirements.txt because I'm not directly using the NumPy library. Okay. Now LangChain I'm using. Uh, there is a version of this LangChain that I've used, but the NumPy required by this LangChain version that I'm using is changed now. So this is what I'm mentioning as internal libraries. So usually you don't mention this internal libraries in your requirements.txt, but when there is an update, then that's going to create an issue. Again, this may not happen always, but when this happens, it's really a pain because we wouldn't know where is the exact part that's failing. So that's a problem. So poetry, what it does is it auto resolves all the conflicts that it's getting, and it locks all the libraries that you're going to need, not just the ones that you have in your requirements.txt, not the ones that you're using in your project, but all the internal libraries are also kind of like logged in your poetry.log. Whereas in the case of requirements, we just like manually mention like these are the versions and so on. And some dependencies we usually don't put it in the requirements.txt. So that's a problem, and that poetry solves that. So for installing this packages, right? So we in pip install, so we say that pip install numpy, pip install pandas, or something like that, right? Whereas in the case of poetry, we can just say poetry add numpy or pandas or something like that. So it will automatically add this. And once you install this, all these libraries and the versions are also automatically captured and pinned in the poetry.log. Whereas if you do a pip install of numpy, you have to manually update this requirements.txt. So that's like important. Whereas in the case of this poetry, it automatically updates like all these configuration files, but we have to do this manually in requirements.txt. And here we have clean development and production dependency separation. So if the environment is development environment, so we can just like mention this in the project 2YAML file and so on. So that's going to handle like those proper separation of environments that we are working on. So whereas in the case of requirements, right? So we have to have like separate files for development, production, and so on. So poetry installs, it's a full environment. So let's say you have already worked on it. If you want to replicate this on a different machine or a different folder, all you can do is just run this poetry installs. This is going to set up a virtual environment, and it's going to install all the exact library versions that's mentioned in this poetry.log. So in this case of pip install, we would do a pip install -r requirements.txt, and that's only going to install the packages. Still, you have to build your virtual environments and so on. So these are the main advantages when we use poetry. Again, as you move forward, right, when you're working on application, it's always recommended that you use poetry so that you handle this part of dependency management like much better. Okay, so these are the comparative analysis that we have with poetry and pip install requirements.txt. So now let's understand how we can set this up in our system, like when you're starting to work on a Python project. So how you can set up a project with poetry, handle all the dependencies and the libraries that we need. Okay, so let's get started. So I'll go to Chrome and just going to search for this poetry documentation, and we can just follow the step-by-step process here in order to understand this better and replicate that. Okay. So here we have this official documentation, introduction documentation for Poetry Python. So navigate to this. So this has like the step-by-step process for which using which we can just like get started with poetry and then just like work on it directly. So in this, first we have to make sure that we download and install this. If you are on like Linux, there are like different steps. If you are on Windows, then we can follow different steps. So we have pipx and official installer manually, and there are like different ways to do this. So we can go with the official installer, which is like pretty simple. If you are on Mac OS, Linux, or the Windows subsystem for Linux, you can use the curl command. If you're just like working with Windows predominantly, you can just like use this PowerShell command, invoke web request command. So I'm working on a Windows machine, so I can copy this and run this. And here they have given a note that if you have installed Python through Microsoft Store, you have to replace this py at the end with Python. If not, if you have downloaded the Python from their official site, you can just like copy this direct command and run this. So I'll copy this, and I think they have also mentioned this for Poetry, you need like Python 3.9 plus. So 3.10 and the other versions are going to work. So yeah, that's something that you have to remember. So currently I'm running it on Python 3.12, so I should be good with that. So make sure that you satisfy this particular condition. So I'm going to copy this command of installing Poetry in this Windows PowerShell thing, and I'm going to open my PowerShell. So go to your search bar and search for Windows PowerShell. So I also have like pinned it to the taskbar, and I can just like paste this command directly. So that's going to download Poetry and install this. And this is like the version that it's going to, install, and everything is going to work as given here. So the next step is right. So you can skip this advanced process. Like as yeah, again they have mentioned that you can skip this step if you simply want the latest version and already install Poetry as described in the previous step, and so on. Right. So for us, like we probably like don't need this to configure this a bit more. So we can just like go with the initial process that we have followed. The next step is adding Poetry to your path. So we have to run commands, Poetry commands on our terminal, and for us to do that, right, we should put the path of Poetry in our environment variable. So then only we would be able to run this commands on our terminal. So that would be the next step. So the installation is still running. Okay, let's wait. So what it basically does is when you install it on Python, it's going to get installed. Poetry is going to get installed in a folder like app data Python script. So we have to copy this folder's path and put it in our environment variables in Windows. Then it can like recognize Poetry, and it can like execute the commands that we want to run. So that's like the basic process that we have over here. And you have seen like the installation is like happened correctly and so on. If I run the command like Poetry double hyphen version, so it says that Poetry is not recognized. So this is what I was saying, because this is exactly kind of like installed in this particular location. C uses Sid, which is my username for this PC, app data roaming Python script. So we have to add this to the path environment variable. So I'm going to copy this thing, scripts. Okay, I'll copy this. I can also show you where this is exactly present, right? So I'm going to this users, Sid, and app data, and within that I have this roaming and Python. That would create this scripts poetry.exe. So we have to copy this exact folder path, not the path of poetry.exe, but we should copy this parent directory scripts folder path. Okay, so we have to do that. So, or we have already copied it from the terminal as well. So we are good with that. And I'm going to go to my search bar and search for env. So that's going to give you the edit the system environment variables option, and open that, and that's going to open this particular tab. And in the system properties, you have an option called as environment variables. And within that, you have variables, OneDrive, and so on. We have to choose this path, double click this path, and you will see like all this list of paths that's available. So click on this new, and we are going to paste this path that we have copied. C use as your username, app data, roaming Python scripts. You can find the exact path that's given here. This is for my system. Few things may slightly change on your machine. So copy that exact path, put it over here, click on this OK, again OK, and we have another OK over here. So that is pretty much it. So now if I run this Poetry version, okay, I have to restart this terminal. Let me restart this, and we can again run this. There should probably work. Let's see. It says 2.1.2. Okay, so everything is working as expected now. So I'll close this. The next step is I have a folder here. So it's in my local disk D, work PyCharm projects, and 25 427 poetry pip. So I'm in this directory. You can be on any directory on your machine. And I'm going to open the terminal from here. So I'm going to right click, open this terminal. So I'm going to run the commands on this particular directory now. Okay, so here we are going to set up a basic project with Poetry. So I open the Poetry documentation, and we can in the left navigation introduction we are like good with this, like basic installation of Poetry we are good. Next you can go to this basic usage, and this is the command to create a new Poetry project. Okay, so Poetry new Poetry demo, we can name this anything, right? It doesn't have to be Poetry demo, we can change this as well. Let's say I'm going to run this as Poetry new Poetry project or something. So I'll call this as Poetry new Poetry project 1. Let's say that this is the name of this particular project that we are creating. So the moment I run this, it's going to create some basic files that this project needs. It says that it packaged poetry project one has been created here and so on. So if I come back to this file browser, the thing that we have seen, so a project folder would have been created. So it has src, some just some placeholder files in which you can just like write your scripts, you can like do your thing and so on. Okay, so now we can open this project poetry project one in PyCharm, and from there like we can write the codes there, install libraries, we can do like bunch of stuff there. So I'm going to open my PyCharm, and you don't have to create a new project because we have like already created the project. So rather you have to click on this open, and then give this exact path that we have created. So we have this poetry project one, right? So click on this poetry project one, click on OK, say trust project, and this is what we have. So as you can see over here, so we have created a poetry project, we have installed poetry. If we have done all these steps correctly, PyCharm automatically recognizes that you have installed poetry in your machine. So you would find the poetry executable, and it says that I find this py contains project dependencies. Would you like to set up a poetry environment? So it automatically recognizes that this is a poetry based project, and it asks whether we need to set up this environment. You can just like click on this OK, and it does everything. The if you have any virtual environment configurations, it would be done. If you have any libraries mentioned, so all these would be done automatically, right? If you see here, we don't have the poetry.log file, but when I click OK, so all those are going to be like created. So let's see. So this is configuring the Python interpreter, which is in this case the it's going to poetry is going to handle that virtual environment. So here you can see we have poetry. It's a poetry's virtual environment, poetry project one, the name of the project that we have created, and then we have this Python version as well. So I can refresh this from reload from disk, and now you can see the poetry.log file has also been created. So this is like that much simple in PyCharm. Okay. So if you're not able to do this right, if it's not automatically recognized, which it should, you should be able to do like once you follow these exact steps. If it's not happening, you can click on this part, right? You either see this poetry or you would see this no interpreter. You can click on this, scroll below, you will see this add new interpreter, and go to this add new local interpreter, and in this you can click this generate new. Instead of type as virtual environment, you can click on this poetry. So you would have the base Python and path to poetry. There are two options here. One is it automatically captures the path of this poetry. Make sure that you have this path in your environment variables as well. If it's not recognized right, there would also be an option to install poetry via pip. You can follow that as well. So poetry now gets installed via pip, and again then you can just like do the exact process. So that's possible as well. But in most cases, you should see like the exact thing that I'm seeing. So download and install poetry with the command you run in Windows PowerShell, create a new project and open it in PyCharm, and then you will get a pop-up saying that whether you need to set the environment up and everything. So everything is sorted. If you open the terminal, you will see the virtual environment's name. So it's poetry project one, and then we have some alphanumeric combinations with the Python version, so on. This is the virtual environment that we are currently in. Okay, so this is a process. So now you open this pyproject.2yaml files, and it's going to contain some information. So we have the name of the project that we have created, the versions, authors, and so on. So in this author, you are seeing this name and the email. This is kind of captured automatically from your, if you have configured git, right? So you would probably have run git config username, email address, and so on. So it automatically captured all these details from those configurations, right? So if I change my git primary username and so on, and again create a new uh, project, then that particular email address would be captured. So it's not something that I have manually edited, but all these are captured automatically. And then we have a README file, and it says like what's the required Python version. So this is coming from the Python version that I have in my machine. So it says that this project, all these are basically like the details related to the project. So when we replicate this on a different machine, right? So when you put this on a different machine, so poetry looks at all these things and tries to see that whether Python 3.12 is installed, and everything would be taken care of. So we have like all those aspects. So now I'll open this poetry log. So here I have the package list. Here it's empty because we haven't like uh, you know installed any libraries, and it says this file is automatically generated and should not be changed by hand. So we don't have to change anything manually. So that's very important. So we don't have to do this. Okay, so now we are set. So what we did is initiated a basic project, and just like connected it to PyCharm, and we have created a virtual environment. Basically, Poetry did that automatically, right? So let's say that I'm going to install NumPy. So I can open this terminal. All I have to do is say Poetry space add, and let's say NumPy. Okay, this is just like doing pip install NumPy. Either you can do this, or if you want a specific version of NumPy, you can mention that as well. Let's say we want to mention like the NumPy version. Let's see how we can do this. And go to Google and search NumPy PyPI, and this is the version. We have NumPy 2.2.5. So I'll copy this, come back to this terminal, say double equal to, and mention like the version number, okay, and run this. So this is going to install NumPy. Right. So now you can see like this poetry.log is updated, right? So we have NumPy version, fundamental package for array computing Python. We have description, all those things. So if you scroll below, like this is the only library that has been installed. So now let's say we are installing some other library, the request library, which we use to call the APIs. So I'm going to say poetry add request. Here again I can give the latest version, or I can just like leave it as it is and run this poetry add request. Now if I open this, I think this would need like more libraries along with request. Let's see. So we have request. Right. So if you see this in this poetry log, right, it doesn't have only request library, but it also like have other packages as well. So it has like qrlib3, which again this request library uses, and so on. So this is what I mean by saying the internal libraries. So when you install a library, just like NumPy and then request, you don't have to do anything. It's automatically captured in this poetry.log and also all the other internal libraries that it's going to need. But whereas if you are using a pip install requirements.txt, right, if you install this request library and the NumPy library, you have to manually look at the exact library version that has been installed, and you have to update your requirements.txt. Whereas in this case, we don't have to update this poetry.log, so it automatically like does like all those things, and we have like list of libraries that has installed over here. Again, let's say that we are installing pandas library. So you will see like all the other additional libraries that are installed: certify, carset, idna, urlib request, and so on. So we have like all this library. If there are any conflicts as well, right, so it would also be resolved in this particular step. So now let's say I'll say poetry add pandas, and it's going to install like you will see like these are the other additional libraries that are getting installed. It says if there are any updates, removals, and so on. So all these things are like kind of like happens, and the poetry.log is also gets updated. And then here we have this. If you open this project.2yaml, now you see that the dependencies are NumPy, request, and pandas. So all these are automatically captured. You don't have to do anything. You can just like install one library after the other, and all these are like tracked separately in your pyproject.2yaml file, and then your project PyProject YAML and the poetry.log file. So all these are like captured over here. Okay, so that's the other thing. So now let's say that we are creating a new project with this specific requirement, right? So let's say that you have worked on this project, you have pushed this to GitHub. Now we have to, someone else is pulling. So let's say that two people are working in a team. So you have worked on this and they have to replicate this. So they pull this and then they have to install the virtual environment on their machine. They may have a different Python, a different library version may have installed. So Poetry is going to like handle all those things. So all they have to do is like pull all this code and just run Poetry install, and that's going to like handle all these things. So let's see how that can be done. So let's say that I have this Poetry project one, right? So let's say I'm creating a new folder, and let's name this as Poetry project 2. Think about this as we have worked on this files and then we have pushed these things. So src test poetry.project.2yaml readme. Let's say that we push all this file to GitHub, and from GitHub think about this. Assume that we are like kind of pulling this files like all these things here. So let's say this is something that you have worked on it. This is like some other person is like now pulling your project code and they want to set up their environment. Okay, so let's consider like that's the case. So now all they have to do is let's say open PyCharm and create this open. They can just select this project to click on OK, trust project, new window. Mm, okay, so this again kind of like gives you this thing. Okay, file pyproject.2ml. So again, when they open this, it automatically looks at the pyproject.2ml file, and now it has like all the library versions installed, right? So think about this PyProject one, a poetry project one as you have worked on, and someone else is working on a different machine for this. So let's assume that's the case. So now it automatically installed all the library versions that mentioned in this project.2ml, poetry.log. So all those kinds of happens over here. So Python interpreter has been configuring, and then we see this. This is a different virtual environment, poetry project 2. And now like all the libraries are installed, everything is set, right? So they don't have to create a virtual environment separately. They don't have to install this separately. So all these kind of like happens automatically over here. And then you would app this, so it's getting installed, everything is happening, and then you can just do a pip list, and that's going to give you the list of libraries. Like once this is installed, you will see like request pandas and everything, so all these are installed. So this is how this entire process kind of happens. Okay, so if you are doing this on PyCharm, now let's consider another scenario. So I'm going to close this. Let's close this as well. Let's say we are running this on a EC2 instance, a Linux machine where you probably wouldn't be working on PyCharm, right? So everything is in, you have to work with terminal. So I'm going to create a new project. Let's call this as Poetry Project 3. Let's say that this is the name. And similarly, I've worked on this code and then like I've pushed this to GitHub. Let's say from our EC2 instance, we have to set up this poetry project. What we would do is open this poetry project directory, not the base directory, the poetry actual project 3 directory. Assume that this is now we are in a EC2 instance or something in a Linux machine. Okay, so there we would access this with the terminal, and now all I have to do is say poetry install. So now it's going to create virtual environment and everything. Again, we are not doing this on PyCharm now. Rather, this is happening on, let's say, your EC2 instance and so on. So this poetry install creates a virtual environment called as this one. This is coming from the base project name that we did, right? So all those things happens. It create a virtual environment in this place, and it installs like all this library. So this is how we can replicate this, and it's like pretty straightforward, pretty simple, right? So the process is you create a poetry project and set up the environment in your local machine and so on. Pull it to kind of like push it to GitHub, and someone else in your team would push this code, and then they would set up their machine with the environments with the same Python versions and library versions and so on. So we probably won't get any conflicts there, and everything is set properly. Again, you would push if there are any changes, and in your EC2 in the Linux machine, usually where you would do this deployment, you would again like just run this poetry install command. That's going to create the virtual environment automatically, and then it's going to just handle everything there. It's going to install the libraries and so on. Just run the poetry install command. If I just open this and show this to you, again we have like the all those things that we have just now like discussed. So all these are kind of mentioned here. So installing the dependencies, this is what we have basically done. So install the defined dependencies for your project. Just run the poetry.install. So this is going to install the virtual environment, just like install all the required libraries and so on. If I open this project right in PyCharm, here we don't have to create a new virtual environment. So if I just say that open, and I'm going to open this third project directory that we have created, test project, this window. Okay, so now again you can just like follow the same process, and everything like goes as smooth as possible. So if you're working on PyCharm. So this creates a virtual environment here. But again, if you're working on a machine where you don't have access to the graphical user interface and so on, you can just like simply run the poetry install command, and that's going to like kind of like take care of like everything. Okay, so that's the entire process. So the main reason that we wanted to discuss about this, right, not just specifically for dependency management, not just for Python projects, it's very critical for all the generative AI projects that we are doing, because before it was simple, right? So before we probably have worked on the machine learning use cases, deep learning use cases, and so on, and usually there won't be that much change in the libraries. So it's like the library should be updated like once in a month, once in 20 days or something like that. But so many things are happening in the field of generative AI, and we often use libraries like langchain, we use libraries like llama index and everything. So many changes are happening that new versions are coming like on a weekly basis. Maybe I'll just show the langchain release history to you. So if we search for langchain community PYPI. So this is the latest version 0.3.23. If I go to the release history, right, the latest version came on just today's date, 29th April. April 29 is the latest version. April 22 as the previous version, just like 7 days before. April 4 as the previous version. So as you can see, within like week or 10 days new versions are coming, and it's very hard to manage all these libraries, right? So this is the reason we are kind of, instead of just going with the requirements.txt, where it could create conflicts, and later when you run this project, let's say after a month, when you reinstall all this in a different machines, definitely it's going to create a lot of problems. So it's always much better when you are working on a production level application, when you want a streamlined development environment, it's better to use this proper dependency management tool instead of just using a pip install and a requirements.txt. So I hope that you got a clear idea of how to use poetry and so on. So what I would suggest you is just practice whatever we have done, and if you are working on some personal projects and so on, please try to handle that with poetry. So as you just like work on more projects, you would get a more clear understanding, more practice at that, and again, as I said, your development would be like much better. And even when we are deploying with Docker, right, so instead of putting the pip install command on Docker, instead we can just use poetry on Docker. So again, that's going to make it like more streamlined, more standard way of development and deployment process. So that's the idea. So I hope you have understood all the things that we have discussed. And again, we have kind of discussed like about all this different comparison that we did from poetry and pip requirements or txt. So please practice this, and if you face any issues, right, if you are not able to solve some things, and if it's not recognized in your PyCharm, let me know. I'll try to kind of like guide you on the process. So I'll see you in the next upload. Thanks for watching.